Okay, so as I was saying, today we're going to talk about some of the content of Chapter 8. We're going to get through about half of Chapter 8 with what we talked about last week and then what we're going to talk about today. But on Thursday of this week, please remember that I announced last week, on Thursday of this week, I'm going to be in class at the normal time, but we're not going to have any kind of lecture or note-taking. I'm going to be here to help people with any of the past work that they might need to do or redo in order to have a decent midterm grade. I've got emails out to people so that you can know who you are if in my opinion, you need to turn in Project 1 or return in Project 1. A few people haven't ever turned anything in to me to begin with, or a few people turned something in and got a very, very low grade. So if that is you, then you've gotten an email from me about that. If you made like a D or higher on Project 1, I probably didn't email you about it, but if you have a desire to redo it, then Thursday is going to be kind of your work day. So whether you're an online student or whether you're a face-to-face student, you can come to me and during my office hours or during class time, and I'll help you get those things finished if you need it, because I want you to be successful in class, and so I don't know what else I can do other than like sit down and have some one-on-one time with you. If you want it, the ball's in your court. If you want it, I'll sit down and have some one-on-one time with you to help you improve your scores if you need to. So I've already worked on some of what the syllabus calls Project 2. So if you're following along on the syllabus, we were supposed to have 6 or 7 quizzes before midterm. We're going to end up with 6. We were supposed to have 5 reaction papers before midterm. We're going to end up with 6 or 7 opportunities. I think it's 7 opportunities. So hopefully you have taken advantage of 5 of those opportunities at least. So I'm going to be using 5 reaction papers, 6 quizzes, dropping the low score, and 2 projects. But since people struggled, I wanted Project 1 to be something where you could show your geography and knowledge, but do it by demonstrating something that you have fun with or that you enjoy anyway, like watching movies or playing video games or something, following politics or whatever it is your thing is. And some people did, but I didn't have the results that I was hoping for on Project 1, so I'm going to make Project 2 much more like a traditional test, at least with multiple choice questions and true-false questions and maybe some short answer essays. I haven't finished doing it yet, designing it yet, so it might end up being all multiple choice. I haven't decided yet, but it's a 100-point test/project, it says on the syllabus, and it's going to be due on Sunday over this coming weekend. I will have it finished today or tomorrow and post it. So it'll definitely be posted before class time on Thursday. So if you have questions about it, I can also field questions about it during our regular Thursday class time. And for face-to-face students, Thursday, of course, is reaction paper day. So if you need to get another one of those 10-pointers in before I make that midterm average, then bring me those papers. Okay, but there will be no quiz this week for face-to-face or for online students. Okay, so we'll use those previous 6 quizzes and drop the low score on that. Okay? Are we good? Okay, so, and don't forget to get out and vote today if you haven't already done it. So let's talk about where all this voting stuff came from to begin with. This is going to sound a little bit like a history class today when we're talking about political geography, but I'm going to skip over. You history buffs in my cultural geography world here are going to be probably dissatisfied with how quickly I'm going to skip over huge sections of history in order to talk about the political structure that we need to talk about in order to understand where this political process that we're seeing happen in the news right now, the origins of it and where it came from. Okay? So, and like I said, this goes along with Chapter 8, and I've got a couple pages that maybe I didn't write all of them on the board, but there will be occasionally where I say, oh, look at this map, or look at this graphic, or something from Chapter 8, so that we can better understand what it is that I'm talking about. Okay, so I've got an outline, sort of, written on the board up here. Let me go, I do have a different color marker from what I used before. And I've got some key terms as far as like political organizations go. some key terms that's basically vocabulary that we need to kind of dissect in order to understand how nations, how this concept of a city or a concept of a nation or a state, what is the United States of America, and does that word state have a significance, and how do we group things into regions like the Super Tuesday region, which we can talk about today, and you'll see maps of today. So this is tiny bit of historic background, although I'm not going to give you dates to memorize, and then we're going to try to work our way up into the way that the world is organized into political entities today, and where that process came from, the cultural hearth from which that organizational concept came from. Okay, so we're going to look at the origin of where we get political regions from. So you will notice here that I use the word region, one of our 5 themes of geography, right? We can have formal regions. We can have what other kind of region? Formal region. Good guess, not informal. We have, but that was a good guess. Formal region, perceptual region, and one more, and functional region, right? So we have 3 key words that go with regions that we need to talk about here. And when I use the word region as one of our themes of geography in this conversation, we are talking about formal regions with something called a geopolitical border. So any of the maps in Chapter 8, any of the maps in any of the chapters leading up to Chapter 8, you can refer to right now in your textbook to look at geopolitical borders, or in our mental maps, you know, the way that we construct our world, probably is, well, let's use Arkansas as an example. Probably all of us, if we've lived in Arkansas for any length of time, we can see in a mental map the borders of what the state is shaped like, right? Or Oklahoma with that long panhandle, right? Or Florida, we even call it the Florida Panhandle. Probably the states in our functional region of the South, or perceptual region of the South, we can probably imagine what those borders are. But where did those borders come from? How did they originate? Why did they originate? The why of where comes in here. Why do we have political borders where we have political borders? And what's politics and where did it come from? Okay, so those are the questions that geographers ask when we're looking at these outlines on a map that we color code with different kinds of pretty rainbow colors. This one, I guess, over here is the prettiest map with all the different variety of colors. Okay, so something that you've heard about in history, undoubtedly from high school on up until your community college days, is something called a city-state. Am I right? Have you heard that before? Okay, so in history class, you will hear often about city-states, and I don't know, I'm sure that you all have better teachers than I did when I was sitting in your seat, but I remember going to class, history class, and it was Western Civilization 1, like the first part, that went all the way back to like Egypt, it went all the way back to what we call ancient Greece and Athens that I've got written here, the Roman Empire. I remember hearing about all those kinds of things, and I remember hearing this concept of a city-state. That was a weird sounding word to my ears. Because it was weird sounding because I didn't have like a modern day reference for it. In the evolution of culture and society and civilization in the world, central powers or an organizing governance structure tended to arise in a cultural hearth in a hierarchical way, where a city in particular, Rome, as my first example up here, Rome came to be the seat of power and governance. It came to be the seat of what we call modern and yes, I'm using the word modern to talk about ancient Rome, at the time when Rome was the central power, it was the cultural hearth, Rome was responsible for spreading modern culture, modern for the day, to all of the regions around that were included in a map of the Roman Empire, okay? And you can Google, there's not a map of this in your textbook, but if you would like to Google at the moment what some of the boundaries were in ancient Rome, it might be helpful for you to look at what the Roman city-state looked like. Excuse me. But the purpose or the function of the city-state was that the town, the city, was the center of the political power. It was the center of the most, look at my air quotes, important cultural component, the controlling component of culture, and that it controlled a huge region. I've forgotten that I've written some of this already on the board behind me. It controlled a huge region around them, a functional region in that the armies of Rome controlled it and unified it, but also a geopolitical region because the Roman Empire had definite boundaries where Roman rule applied, Roman governance applied, laws applied, citizens were subject to those laws, and then on the boundaries, you had people who were not part of a culture included within the Roman Empire. Okay, that's a lot of information in that short sentence. So, okay, so Rome, as the central government authority, controlled a huge region that had lots of different cultures within it. Culture, as we learned in chapter, was that 4 or 5? I can't remember one of the recent chapters. Culture, of course, binds people together through shared customs, traditions, languages, religions, all of these things. Chapters 6 and 7 that we'll start with after midterm is over, chapters 6 and 7 look at some major markers of culture, like language is one of those chapters, and religion is another one of those chapters. Those are some major markers of culture. So, what Rome did as the controlling city, it unified only through government. It unified lots of different cultures around it and imposed its rule of law on those cultures. I often have a lot of biblical scholars in my classes here at UAPTC who know a lot about the stories of the Bible and the historic references within that book. Okay? So, for instance, you will read in the New Testament about how the Romans and the Jews, or the Gentiles, all these, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you will read about all of these different cultural groups who were subject to the Roman Empire. Jews had different laws that they had to follow, Sadducees, Gentiles, these different cultural groups were named in the Bible, for instance, as being subjects of Rome, but culturally distinct. The Hebrews had Hebrew language, had Jewish faith, different from the Roman pantheon of gods, right? Okay, so all of these things that I'm touching on very briefly here are part of your historical knowledge if you've gone through those Western civilization classes, or now we call it world civilization classes. And that modern culture, which would include the Roman pantheon of gods, the Roman republic concept, the Senate, and that kind of governmental organization, that would have been modern culture that was imposed on other cultures around it. Other cultures were not forced to give up their old ways and take on Roman ways. Other cultures were preserved within the box, can I say box? Within the confines of the Roman Republic. Okay, so that's what city-state means. I've used Rome as the example. I've got Athens here. There are some city-state examples that we can look at in Asia also, and in South America too. You can look at this city-state model where there's a whole bunch of different cultures to look at. That I think the movie Apocalypto was one of the movies as a choice on Project One, I think. That might be in sociology class, but anyway, Apocalypto is one of the movies that I give people an option to analyze from time to time, and that would be an example of how there's lots of different cultures that have, the otherness associated with them, identifying against each other and perhaps imposing power over one group compared to another because of the differences within it. So Rome did not wipe out the differences. It allowed for, not through equality. You certainly weren't equal to other citizens if you had a unique culture within the Roman Empire. But those cultures were able to be preserved, so to speak. Okay, so as history demonstrates, city-states went to the wayside, so to speak, okay, for a variety of reasons. And instead, over time, in this process, nation-states were born. Nation-states are different than city-states because there is self-governance that the cultural unit of people have over their territory, over their region, okay? So in Rome, and if some of you, I saw that some of you did look up the region that was considered the Roman Empire in ancient Rome. If you look at that map and compare it to a modern day map with all the little divisions of nations on the modern map, you will be able to see that many, many self-governing nation-states exist today within the city-state region of the ancient Roman Empire. Those nation-states, I'm putting this in a definite nutshell, okay? I'm really simplifying this for the purposes of this discussion. But those nation-states identified, it was about cultural identity. They identified as one singular cultural movement or different cultural units, that had a certain sort of commonality among them, and then self-governance of that cultural unit was something that was desirable, fought for. Wars, ancient wars that we learned about in history class, were fought for usually the purpose of getting self-governance of a cultural unit that identified as similar to each other, and therefore wanted that solidarity, wanted that unity that we talked about back in the culture and social identity chapter. How, what comprised the identity? People with a common history, a common religion, a common language, common customs, common way of thinking about time and tradition. And there are usually in nation states many cities. It's kind of like the flip side. You'll have one city controlling many different towns and districts on the city-state, but here a nation state will have an entire region, and there will be many different cities and towns that share a common economic structure, that share a common governance structure, and have this identity, this concept of identity in common. Okay, so nation states came on the horizon in history. I'm moving very quickly now. We're into the second half of the last millennium now. Moving very quickly through BC times up until then. And we need to talk about states, this thing that we live in today. We have this country, we have this nation called the United States of America, or perhaps you've heard of the economic union called the European Union, that has many different nationalities, many different states, so to speak, collected under one particular trade agreement or one particular economic unit. But a state is something that for the founding fathers of this country, it was important to have this identity, this self-identity, and in part, self-governance of a region where common identity existed. So Arkansans, Oklahomans, or Sooners, is that what they call themselves? I'm not sure, right? Texans or Mississippians, these different kinds of concepts are identity related to those geopolitical borders of the states within the United States, okay? So a state has governance inside itself. So we have a governor of Arkansas. We have legislators for different districts in Arkansas. We have different towns that have mayors and city council that have to work with state government. So a state has to govern within itself, but a state also has this concept of a unit, an identity of that unit among all of the different bordering places around it, whether you are part of an island conglomerate, like Hawaii is an archipelago of islands and you have Pacific Ocean between, but these different islands are like counties within the state of Hawaii. You've got to deal with your bordering nations or your bordering states of Alaska or California or Oregon or Washington State, any of those parts of Canada. You deal with the Philippines, you deal with all of the different nations within and states within the Pacific Islands. And so Hawaii, for instance, has authority over itself outside of the authority the U.S. government grants it in order to be able to do trade agreements, in order to be able to do exchanges or have some kind of diplomacy and interaction with other bordering states around it. So, in this state idea, states can have different identities and do. Many people, this was, let me see, how many years ago was it that Colorado legalized wasn't Colorado the first to legalize recreational marijuana? Yeah, and so that became part of Colorado's identity for many people, and I know 5 or 6 entire families who picked up and moved from Arkansas to Colorado for this particular reason, and it wasn't so much because it was recreational use, but because it was open to be able to be used for medicinal reasons, right? And so Colorado has that distinction, and then certain states followed, right? Let me see, how many states do we have now that have that identity? Is it like 13? Oh, I thought it was like 13, I thought. Anyway, the numbers are increasing, right? Because those states are serving as cultural hearths to basically diffuse that culture, diffuse those changes into other regions. And so you see states like Arkansas having ballot initiatives for medical marijuana, which was approved a few years back, and then adjustments to that trying to be made right now, and recreational propositions that are on the ballot also for to be able to use marijuana statewide. The state self-governs in that regard, even though there are national laws against the use of this. In Colorado, that was a big debate, whether when they legalized or re-legalized, I guess is the way I should put it, when they re-legalized the use of marijuana for citizens of the state of Colorado, there was a big debate about how was this going to be allowed, since nationally there is a law against using this drug, but they were the test case, right, that showed that states can self-govern in certain ways, and that's actually the way that in our particular country, the Constitution is designed to give certain powers to the states when it's not granted to the federal government. Okay, so states do not act alone. They typically engage in diplomacy and community with other regions around them, but sometimes there is a state that we call multinational. Okay, So, and we wouldn't call, well, you tell me, when we talk about this multinational state idea, thinking about all of the different ways of life, all of the different government systems, thinking about the different political parties that have control over one state compared to the next, let's look at this description of a multinational state, a government that has many national identities within it. I've just listed several different state identities, like Arkansan or Mississippian or Texan, or all these different state identities. And there's different political parties in power in these different places, different laws that give states identity, like the marijuana laws, or different tax codes, or even different, some people look at abortion laws from one place to the next. And so there's many different state identities within the United States, but this multinational state concept is not applied to the United States typically. Because these national identities often have religion, often have language, often have different governance structures, different government structures within them, and just have one larger government. For instance, the former Soviet bloc, or the former United Soviet States, would be considered a multinational state with regions or national identities like the Ukraine, or like Crimea, or very many different nationalities, back to, more similar really to this city-state idea. We've got a government over many different cultures within it. And so this city-state idea from ancient times is sort of modernized and brought into our century with this multinational state idea. There's a government that centralizes all of these different nations within it. So it sounds similar to what we do, how we organize here in the United States. Sounds very similar, but this national identity concept is the major difference, because we're talking about various language groups, various religious backgrounds, and lots of different ideas about governance within that state border. Have any of you heard of the Free Tibet movement? That's something that you could search, or you could use as a reaction paper topic this week if you would like. Look at this multinational state concept, and Tibet is a region that is part of the government of China. Like, the government of China has authority over Tibet. Most of the time, if we hear about this country in our news media, we'll hear about it as Tibet, as though it's, well, Free Tibet is a movement that tries to get liberation from Chinese authority for those in Tibet. But it is under the authority of the Chinese government. It's a very different cultural unit from ethnic Chinese people. So that's kind of an issue, a touchy issue that comes up with national identities within a multinational state. How do we preserve that local culture, or should we look at it as folk culture? Where's the hierarchical cultural hearth, the government hearth? And human rights are an issue with that kind of thing too. Do we have a right for self-governance or not? So there's a major philosophical question. Go ahead.
I was just going to take a swing into, like, hey, isn't Tibet that mountain region, and they want to be against, or they are against China? They're like, we are not a part of China. China's like, you're a part of us.
Yes, Tibet. Excuse me. Tibet wants to be their own autonomous nation, and you're right.
Where the Dalai Lama?
You're very right. Yes, the Dalai Lama, which is like a Buddhist leader, right? This is a cultural concept that is centered around the religion in the area, the belief system, or that part of cultural identity. You're right, this is a very mountainous area. It's very isolated, and for a while it was left alone, so to speak, because of its isolation. But now China has, I guess for lack of a better word, annexed the region and claims it as part of that nation, multinational, in this example, state. But yes, it is my understanding, and you could do more research on this to find out more specifics. But yes, Tibet desires freedom, but because of the cultural identity or the national identity, warring about it is not really part of the approved of the cultural identity, the approved of behavior. And so it's kind of like a question. Please keep your hands off us is basically the question and the approach to try to regain independence. And that's why worldwide, one of the reasons why worldwide there is this movement to free Tibet, right? It used to be very, very robust. It was a very active movement back in the 1990s. But it's kind of fallen, at least in the general public mainstream, it's kind of fallen out of the headlines. It's still very active with some, but it's kind of fallen out of the headlines. It would be a good thing for you to research in terms of these geopolitical borders, because they don't always fit. People in power, the hierarchy, the elite in culture, are the ones who get to decide where those geopolitical borders are. And not all of us, they don't make sense to all of us necessarily. I recall, and some of you might have done this too, my husband and I drove across many geopolitical borders one Christmas when we went from Lower Alabama, right at the Florida state line, all the way to Los Angeles, where my mother-in-law lives, and we stayed with them for a few weeks. Long drive. You see a lot of the countryside, a lot of the physical geography of the nation when you make that drive. We crossed many different states, and that cultural imprint or that cultural landscape that we experienced, I could identify a lot with that section of this geography book when we talked about how the cultural landscape is littered with these big box stores. I just saw Walmart after Sam's Club, after Target, all these big shopping malls right against the highways. But when we got to the border between Arizona and California, to the naked eye, there was no difference between the land on this side of the border and the land on this other side of the border. The only way that I knew it was a border, my GPS told me, but also there was a checkpoint. There was an agricultural checkpoint between Arizona and California. Because in California, so much of their economy relies on agriculture, and they have a really strict control over the kinds of pests that don't exist in California and that can exist in other states. This checkpoint was stopping every car that wanted to go into California, not to check a passport like you would need if you were going into Canada or if you were going into Mexico, but to check to see if you had any food in your car. Had you brought any fruit? And a lot of people had brought big fruit baskets. I remember seeing huge fruit baskets that were all done up in bows because we were traveling at the Christmas time. And all of these fruit baskets were being confiscated and carried off over to who knows where and who knows what they did with it. But the idea was these things could have pests inside, that if Grandma ate that grapefruit, accidentally the entire grapefruit crop of California could be affected and die if there was some kind of vermin or some kind of what's the word I'm looking for, pest in there that could annihilate a crop. And so these borders are maintained by states, and when there is a government with national identities, these national identities might not be able to establish their own borders. They're subject to another controlling unit. Okay, questions? Y'all need to take some deep breaths, because I'm the only one with any energy in this room right now. So y'all take some deep breaths and wake up a little bit. Do we need to turn the air on? Is it a little hot? No? We're good? Okay. Alrighty, so moving on to this next very important kind of holdover, I'm going to say that this stateless nation concept is a holdover from ancient times, untouched by Modern society, modern political organization is what I'm going to preface this with. Okay, stateless nations. For instance, I have as an example here page 217 in chapter 8 to look at the Kurds, who you might have heard of in the news. So if you have your book with you, look at page 217 in the book right now to see the map of the region, the really functional region of where the Kurds operate and live that spans geopolitical borders around it. So I see some books, so I'll go ahead and open them up because I'm going to ask you some questions about it. 217. Yep, you can look on your digital copy of your book. Okay, so Kurds, this is a cultural identity. Kurds have an economic system unique to themselves. Kurds have language unique to themselves. Kurds have religious practices, traditions, rituals, etc. All of the items in the definition of the word culture, remember I have the word culture written here, all of the items in the definition of the word culture, the Kurds have an ethnic identity with all of those markers included. The Kurds, however, do not belong to a state. So they are a stateless nation. The nation has an identity, a cultural identity, that has a history of self-governance, but in modern times, geopolitical borders that cultural elites have established in the nation, in the nations surrounding the Kurds have been left out without a national identity. So what are these countries where the Kurds have their, well, you maybe have heard of the term Kurdistan. Have you heard of Kurdistan before? Okay, so look at the countries where Kurdistan should exist. And what are those? Yes, some really key countries, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. Some key countries that are in the news right now because, of course, conflicts that are there. Okay? So, the states of, or the nations of Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, that's where the Kurds' historic boundaries. So they have a common history that shares a general boundary, a functional boundary of migration between Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. The Kurds, therefore, do not belong to Iraq, Iran, or Turkey. Those geopolitical nations are not interested in protection, are not interested in advocacy, are not interested in representation of the Kurds' voice in those governments. Historically, the United States has been the protectors of the Kurds. Historically, the United States has spoken for the Kurds in diplomatic negotiations with those particular cultures. And the Kurds, honestly, have been identified for some of those atrocities that they didn't commit them. They've been victimized with ethnic cleansing and forced migration and some of the issues that we have studied in previous chapters. Because the Kurds belong to nothing, no one but themselves, they've been isolated in modern geopolitical terms because they don't belong. They can't say, I'm Turkish, I'm Iraqi, I'm Iranian. Kurds are a unique identity. Sir?
Were the Romani people also?
I almost wrote the Romani. Oh, I did. Yes, okay. So the Roma, yes, are another really good example. Yes, and I know a little bit about both of these groups, not as much as I would like to, but help me since you mentioned them. So the Roma, if I remember correctly, the ethnic identity originally comes from India, right?
Actually, I don't know much of like the origin history
Yeah.
of Mali. I just know that most of their existence in Europe has basically been like prosecution, being kicked out, not being allowed to.
Exactly. You're absolutely correct to think of the Roma when we're having a similar conversation about the Kurds. Yeah, so I think, and this is another topic that you could look at this cultural group and study for, for a reaction paper this week, look at where they would fit. Like, I don't really know, actually. You could analyze this in a reaction paper, whether the Roma would be considered a nation, because there's not really unity, contiguous unity. It's more of an ethnicity, not necessarily a unified population as the Kurds are. The Kurds have, for the most part, given their own choice, remained a cohesive population within those regions that we're talking about. Whereas the Roma, in response to some of the oppression that you were talking about, being run out and not conforming to the laws of the elite in the area, they've been literally nomadic all over the world. So, for instance, in the United States, the word gypsy, and in Europe also, since you're talking about the European Roma, the word gypsy, which is a derogatory term, really, is applied to the Roma. When I say, have you heard the word gypsy before? What does it mean to you, the word gypsy?
A vagrant nomad?
Yeah.
Okay, a vagrant or a nomad? Okay. Is there any kind of like religious association with the word gypsy that you can think of? Anything else that you would associate? Even stereotypes, you can voice the stereotypes right now.
Not derogatory, but like dictionary definition, a heathen, someone who doesn't practice one of the main three religions.
Okay, so they're not one of the main monotheistic religious followers, typically, right? And in the stereotype that I was thinking that you would know about, sometimes that you get these stereotypes, especially in TV and movies, where it's like fortune tellers or somebody,
Witchcraft.
right? Yes, there's witchcraft.
See,
like you
I
can
wasn't
go to
sure.
them.
Like I wanted to say Wiccan, but I wasn't sure.
No, not Wiccan, not neo-pagan or anything, but yeah, somebody who has. Well, how would you describe somebody who has just a mysticism, so to speak, like a mystic, right? You can read messages in the wind or something like that, right? And I mean, these are stereotypes that I'm listing here, right? But these stereotypes come from perceptions of otherness, identifying against cultural groups, right? We tend to hyperinflate the otherness and focus on it as, we turn it into weirdness or wrongness or any of those other words where we can be ethnocentric about others. But yeah, you're right to think of the Roma here as stateless people scattered all across the globe. You will have to look into more deep definitions and classifications of stateless nations to see whether the Roma actually fit into that. Okay, there's really not. I think that another stereotypical thing that we hear of in the United States for the Roma in the United States is like there's a king and queen of the gypsies, so to speak, to use that phrase. Somewhere in Louisiana, I believe, is supposedly the cultural hearth for the Roma in the United States. But again, there's a good little project for a reaction paper if you'd like. Another, one more group that has a stateless nation that I would like to mention. It was mentioned on page 24 of chapter 1, the Masai, and we will talk about them again when we look at economic geography. But the Masai are a good example of a stateless nation of people. The Masai, as far as we can tell from anthropological data, the Masai have been around for 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years in the Tanzania and Kenya areas of Africa. So just like this map, I don't have a map in the textbook to show you, but you can Google a map of Masai land if you would like to see it. But it spans Kenya and Tanzania on the eastern side of Africa, okay? And they have stayed stateless for their entire existence. They have resisted modern advances of culture. They have resisted being controlled by nation states or by multinational state. They've resisted these efforts and stayed relatively autonomous. So they are definitely a nation because they have self-governance, but they don't recognize these borders like the Kurds historically do not recognize these borders. And when you go from one nation to the next, geopolitics these days requires a passport. How many of you all have a passport in this room? Some folks, some people have a passport? Yes. Just looking at the process for applying for a passport, you can look at all the identity, looking at all the checks that they ask you to fill out this information and that, and verify this about yourself. Because geopolitical borders are very, very interested in who's passing over those, who's passing over those lines that are drawn on the map. People who are from stateless nations of people, like the Kurds, are not interested in passports and have no kind of cultural background to understand why that would be necessary. This is my general region where I have always traveled, and when I say I have always traveled, I'm speaking for my entire kinship group that for centuries has occupied this region and been essentially nomadic and migrated, cyclical migration through this region for centuries. And so why all of a sudden should there be a border wall? Why all of a sudden should there be a checkpoint? Not like the one that I described to you in California where they were simply trying to protect an agricultural crop, but because we need to keep track of whose feet are on the ground from this side of the border to the next. How many of y'all have been to Texarkana, Arkansas? Anybody? Several people? So Texarkana, funny name, right? So we've got that funny name because we've got a geopolitical border that runs smack dab through the middle of, not quite smack dab, that's a technical term too, by the way, right? Smack dab. Not really geologically or geographically in the middle of it. Most of, at least the last time I went to Texarkana, most of the sprawl seemed to be happening on the Texas side. But I believe the road that separates Arkansas from Texas is actually called State Line Road or State Line Avenue or something. Anybody remember? I think it's one of the exits off the interstate. It's State Line Road, and literally the gas stations on this side of that road are in Texas, and the gas stations on this side of that road are in Arkansas, right? And are subject to those different laws. You can go from one state to the next in about 30 seconds because you're on that geopolitical border. These things might be slightly interesting to people like us who don't have these checkpoints at the borders, don't have passports that will allow them to pass or not pass. But in the case of the Kurds, when they're moving from these different countries like Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, by the way, historically don't get along with each other well, and so there's a lot of interest in who is passing across these borders, if they're even going to be open at all. This creates major problems for stateless nation groups such as the Kurds. It creates major problems for stateless nation cultures like the Roma, who, as you correctly pointed out, are rounded up in some cases and expelled from certain regions, or rounded up and imprisoned, or run out for the otherness that they exhibit. Okay? And sometimes otherness simply comes from the fact that you have a different political system, such as right now you're hearing a heck of a lot in our political system about how we need to preserve democracy. Have you heard any of the Democratic candidates say that in the news lately? We need to focus on preserving democracy. And they're using this word as a cultural identifier compared to one political candidate who is being isolated, I guess, or targeted for having a different kind of economic structure and idea for our nation. Anybody know what I'm talking about here? You want to help me here? Bernie Sanders is a socialist, right? Y'all know Bernie Sanders? Yep, we're all pretty aware of Bernie Sanders, right? Some of us have have his name on the back of our cars even, right? I've seen a lot of those bumper stickers. But you hear a ton of candidates. I can't turn on the radio, the news. You'll have to look at Instagram or wherever it is that you get your memes of political news these days. But preserving democracy is a cultural identifier for some parts of the Democratic Party right now. And it's basically unified against the otherness of this socialist candidate, Bernie Sanders, who's extremely popular among folks your age, especially, I think. The last time I saw a poll about it. So anyway, these identities can be unique to certain states within countries like ours where we have this federation, or in some cases, some people analyze it as a confederation of states that make up a larger country. These political systems can identify otherness. Wars are fought because of this otherness, and geopolitical borders are redrawn constantly because of otherness. There's a very good, I think it's just a portion of a documentary that I have in my playlist on the YouTube channel of how the states in the United States got their shapes, and how it's not always, doesn't always follow physical geography borders, like a river goes here. There's one state, I think it's Kentucky, where a tiny little part of one of the counties hops over a river and comes right back, and it's kind of geographically isolated, surrounded by otherness, so to speak. So, questions? Any questions? This is the logistical stuff behind Chapter 8, and when we get to language and when we get to religion and some of the other topics that we're going to focus on after midterm, we're going to bring in other components of Chapter 8, since this is only about halfway through the material. So that's what you can expect. Chapter 1 all the way through about half of Chapter 8. That's what you can expect your questions to be on for Project 2, which is going to look much more like a test to you than a project. So you will need your textbook from Chapter 1 all the way up through Chapter 8, and you will need your notes from Chapter 1 all the way up through Chapter 8. You won't need to Google much, if anything, and as a matter of fact, if I give you an essay question to write about, I'm interested in your words and the content of what we've discussed in this class, and not an article that you find on Google. I will make that clear, that I don't want any kind of outside source like that used in an essay question answer if I end up with essay questions on the test. So please watch for that announcement that the test is available. Don't wait to access it. I will have it set so that you can access it and save it as many times as you like, but you get one submission. Okay, you get to submit it one time. And it's going to be a long one. It is 100 points, so it's going to be a long assignment, so to speak, for you to complete. So please, when you see that announcement go out to your email that the test is available, please access it right away, whether you are going to sit there and answer any questions at that moment or not. At least access it and scroll through it so that you can see what's expected of you, and then budget your time and find some quiet geography study time where you can sit down and complete it piece by piece. Okay? Okay, and text me if you have any questions. I'll be here on Thursday for anybody who needs to ask questions or get help from me for any reason. Okay?